He forbade his wife to touch him in public, but seeing her smile with another man drove him mad. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character, Robert. Robert had always prided himself on being a man of control. His life was meticulously planned, his work, his home, and most importantly, his marriage to Sarah. They had been married for 5 years, and on the surface, their life together seemed perfect. They had the house, the cars, the vacations, and on every social media post, they looked like the ideal couple. But beneath this perfect exterior, a much darker truth lingered. Robert had always been an intensely jealous man. He could not stand the idea of his wife, Sarah, showing affection or attention to anyone other than him, especially in public. He had a very clear rule: no public displays of affection. To Robert, love was something private, something that should be kept between them, away from the eyes of others. This rule wasn't just about modesty, it was about control. Over time, this rule became a constant in their lives. Sarah, at first, went along with it, thinking it was just a small quirk of Robert's. But soon, it became more than a simple preference. It was a demand. Whenever they were out at a party or a family gathering, Robert would always position himself between Sarah and any other man, sometimes even pulling her closer if she laughed too much or smiled at someone. Sarah, although uncomfortable, did not say anything. She loved Robert, and in her mind, this was just a small price to pay for their seemingly perfect marriage. But over time, she started to feel like she was losing herself. She felt confined, trapped in a relationship where her every move was watched, where her smiles and gestures had to be measured, controlled. There were moments when she just wanted to feel free, to be herself again, but she didn't know how to break the pattern. Robert didn't see it that way, though. He thought he was protecting her. To him, the outside world was a place full of temptations, and he needed to keep his wife close to him, where no one else could take her away. His love for her, in his mind, was about keeping her safe from the prying eyes of other men. But that all changed the night Sarah met John. John was a new colleague at work. He was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. At first, their conversations were casual, just work-related chatter. But soon, Sarah found herself looking forward to these conversations. They made her laugh in a way that Robert hadn't made her laugh in years. John didn't judge her or try to control her, and it felt good to be around someone who appreciated her for who she was, not just as Robert's wife. One evening, Robert and Sarah attended a work event. John was there too, and as the night wore on, Sarah found herself talking to him more and more. They laughed about a silly joke John told, and when he said something particularly funny, Sarah couldn't help but smile brightly. It was a genuine, carefree smile, the kind she hadn't given in a long time. But when Robert saw this, something inside him snapped. His stomach churned with jealousy. He couldn't understand why his wife, his Sarah, was smiling so freely with another man. His control over her had always been absolute, and yet, there she was, laughing with someone else, someone who wasn't him. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in their marriage, Robert saw Sarah as something to be possessed, not just loved. The anger that bubbled inside him was not just about jealousy, it was about fear. Fear that he might lose her. That night, when they returned home, Robert didn't say anything. He couldn't. But his silence was louder than any words. His mind raced, spinning with thoughts of what he had seen. Sarah noticed the shift in him immediately. The warmth between them had disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating distance. She didn't know what had happened, but something had changed. Little did she know, Robert's jealousy had just begun to take on a life of its own. Robert could no longer hide the growing storm inside him. Each day, the tension between him and Sarah intensified, though neither of them spoke about it. He watched her more closely, analyzing every smile, every glance, every laugh. His mind replayed that night at the work event over and over again, the way Sarah had smiled at John, the way her eyes had sparkled with genuine happiness. It gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake off. Every time they were together, he felt an overwhelming urge to keep her to himself, to remind her that she belonged to him, and no one else. At first, Sarah thought it was just a phase, maybe even his way of showing affection. But as the days passed, she began to feel suffocated by his presence, his constant need to control every interaction she had. Robert, in his own twisted way, believed that he was protecting her, keeping her safe from the world. But Sarah felt more like a prisoner in her own marriage. She couldn't go out without Robert tagging along, couldn't talk to anyone without feeling his piercing gaze. Even simple conversations at family gatherings were scrutinized, as if Robert was afraid someone might steal her away. She began to wonder if she was truly loved or if she was simply a possession to him. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself becoming more distant. She tried to keep up the act, smiling, laughing, pretending everything was okay. But inside, she was falling apart. She had no room to breathe, no space to just be herself. It wasn't until one afternoon, when she ran into John at the grocery store, that she realized just how much she had changed. John greeted her with that same easy smile that had made her feel so comfortable at work. He asked how she was doing, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah found herself genuinely opening up to someone. They talked for a few minutes, catching up on work and life, and she laughed more freely than she had in months. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to remind Sarah of who she was before Robert's possessiveness took hold. As she said goodbye to John and walked back to her car, she realized that she had been starved for this kind of simple human connection. She wanted more of it. She didn't know what that meant for her marriage, but she couldn't deny the spark that had been reignited inside her. That evening, Robert was quieter than usual. When Sarah arrived home, she could sense the tension in the air. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed her every movement. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, trying to read her every thought. The unease she had been feeling in their relationship had finally reached a boiling point. She knew something had to change. But what? Sarah had always believed in the idea of marriage, the vow to stay committed through thick and thin. She had stood by Robert through everything, even when he became more and more controlling. But now, she wondered if love alone was enough to keep them together. Robert's behavior had crossed a line. She didn't know if she could continue living like this, constantly monitored, constantly second-guessing herself. And yet, she also didn't want to let go. She didn't know how to break free from the cycle they had built together. She felt trapped, caught between the love she once had for Robert and the person she was becoming. The quiet tension in their home felt unbearable, and Sarah realized that the choice she had to make wouldn't be an easy one. She could stay, endure, and continue to pretend that everything was fine. Or she could finally step away and reclaim the life she had lost. The thought terrified her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that whatever decision she made, it would change everything. The days following Sarah's encounter with John felt heavier than ever. Robert had grown increasingly quiet, and his eyes followed Sarah's every movement. She could feel the tension in the air thick and suffocating. It was as if every smile she gave, every word she spoke, was being weighed and measured. No matter how hard she tried to carry on with her daily routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That evening, after dinner, Robert sat across from her, his gaze intense. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Her mind raced, trying to find the right words. Was he referring to the way she had smiled at John? Did he know? But no, she reminded herself, he couldn't possibly know. She hadn't told him. "I've just been tired," she said, forcing a small smile. "You know how work has been." Robert didn't respond immediately, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced. Sarah hated that she had to lie, but the truth was even more unbearable. She couldn't explain to him the suffocating feeling she had been carrying, the desire for something more than the life they had built together. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next. Sarah continued to go through the motions, but inside, she felt like she was losing herself. Her conversations with John had become more frequent, each one a brief escape from the monotony of her life with Robert. She found herself looking forward to their chats, enjoying the sense of normalcy and ease that had been absent for so long. But as much as she craved John's company, she knew it wasn't right. She was still married to Robert, and she wasn't sure where this connection with John was heading. One evening, as Sarah was leaving work, John stopped by her desk. "Are you free tonight?" he asked casually, his smile warm. Sarah hesitated. She hadn't seen him outside of work, but something in her felt drawn to the idea of spending time with him. She needed a break, something to clear her mind. "Sure," she said before she could think better of it. "I'd love to." Later that evening, they met at a cozy cafe in town. It was a small, quiet place, the kind of spot where you could sit for hours and not be disturbed. They talked about everything and nothing, work, books they liked, the latest movies. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like herself again. She laughed freely, the weight of Robert's controlling presence fading into the background. John's company was easy, refreshing, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to forget about the mess that her marriage had become. But as they walked out of the cafe later, she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. She had crossed a line, even if it was just in her mind. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew she had to make a choice. As she drove home that night, the quiet in her car felt deafening. Robert was already in bed when she got home. His absence was palpable, a reminder of the growing distance between them. She knew she had to confront the truth, she couldn't keep living in this limbo. Something had to change, or she would lose herself completely. But the thought of confronting Robert, of revealing the truth about her feelings, terrified her. She had always been the supportive wife, the one who put his needs before her own. But now, she wondered if she had sacrificed too much of herself in the process. The next morning, as she prepared for another day, Sarah found herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Who was she anymore? The woman she saw in the mirror seemed like a stranger. She had allowed herself to become someone else, someone defined by Robert's needs and desires, not her own. As she left the house, she knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, she had to reclaim her sense of self. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of her marriage, afraid to speak her truth. It was time to make a decision, even if it meant changing everything. The days that followed Sarah's meeting with John were filled with uncertainty. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of dread that weighed heavily on her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about the growing distance between herself and Robert. The quiet moments at home felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Robert had become more watchful, more distant. His eyes never left her for too long, his silence louder than any argument they might have had. He didn't say anything outright, but Sarah could feel the tension, the unspoken words hanging in the air. She wasn't sure if he knew about her time with John, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he suspected something. She had started to pull away from Robert more and more, but at the same time, she found herself looking over her shoulder, wondering if she was being watched. She couldn't go on like this. Sarah knew she had to face her fears, confront the truth of her feelings, and finally make a decision. That evening, after another long day, Sarah found herself sitting on the edge of their bed. Robert was in the bathroom, his footsteps echoing through the quiet house. She stared at the wall in front of her, her thoughts racing. What was she supposed to do? She had built her life around Robert, or rather, around the idea of Robert. He had been her protector, her provider, the person she turned to when she needed stability. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the man she had married. She wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The controlling behavior, the jealousy, the constant surveillance, it had all become too much. And yet, there was still a part of her that was afraid to let go. The fear of what would happen if she left, if she truly stepped out on her own. Would she be able to stand on her own 2 feet? Would she regret walking away? Sarah didn't have the answers, but she knew she couldn't stay in a relationship that was slowly suffocating her. Just then, Robert stepped out of the bathroom, his gaze falling on her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Sarah hesitated for a moment, wondering how to respond. She could feel the weight of his question pressing down on her. Was she okay? The truth was, she wasn't. Not anymore. But she wasn't sure how to say that without breaking everything. "I'm fine," she said softly, not looking him in the eye. Robert didn't press her further, but Sarah could see the confusion in his expression. He didn't understand. He never would. Sarah had been living a lie, pretending that everything was fine, when all along, she was slowly losing herself. But she couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. She had spent so many years being the woman Robert wanted her to be that she had forgotten who she really was. And now, she was faced with a choice: stay in a marriage that was no longer healthy or take a risk and try to find herself again. As Sarah lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about John, about the way he made her feel like she was seen, like she mattered. For the first time in a long time, she had felt free. But she wasn't sure if she could take that step, if she could leave everything behind. Her mind raced with questions, with fears, with doubts. But deep down, she knew she couldn't continue living like this. She couldn't keep pretending. The truth was, she had already begun to change. And she wasn't sure if she could go back to the woman she once was. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the choice she had to make would define everything. Would she stay and continue to endure a life that wasn't hers, or would she break free and find the person she was meant to be? The uncertainty of it all terrified her, but for the first time, she felt like she was starting to take control of her own life. The morning after Sarah's restless night, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken hold of her. As she sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. Robert's controlling behavior, the suffocating silence that had filled their home, and most importantly, the growing realization that she was no longer the woman she used to be. Her marriage had started out as a dream, but over time, it had become a prison. She could feel herself slipping away, like the life she had imagined for herself was being erased, replaced by someone else's expectations. Sarah's mind wandered back to the night she had spent with John. It had been brief, just a couple of hours in a quiet cafe, but it had left a mark on her. She hadn't felt seen or heard in a long time. With John, she had been able to laugh, to talk freely without fear of judgment. She had remembered what it was like to be herself, to be more than just a wife. She tried to push the thought of John out of her mind, but it lingered. The connection they had felt so natural, so easy. It wasn't just about him, it was about her, about the parts of herself that she had buried in order to keep the peace with Robert. She wondered what life would be like if she allowed herself to be free again, if she stopped worrying about Robert's expectations and started living for herself. The choice she had to make seemed impossible. She loved Robert in a way, but she wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. The love she had for him had become tangled with resentment, fear, and doubt. She had spent so long trying to be the perfect wife that she had lost sight of who she truly was. And now, she had to decide if she was willing to fight for herself, to break free from the life that had defined her for so long. Later that day, Sarah sat in her car outside their house. She had just come from work and felt the familiar ache in her chest, the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. She had spent years walking on eggshells, trying to maintain the peace, to avoid Robert's anger and jealousy. But the truth was, she was exhausted. She couldn't keep living in fear, afraid of every glance, every word. She had to choose her own path, even if it meant walking away from everything she knew. As she stepped out of the car, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from John, just a simple message asking how her day was. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the message. It wasn't anything special, but it felt like a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, someone was reaching out to her, someone cared about how she was doing. She quickly typed a reply, and before she knew it, they were texting back and forth, just like they had that day at the cafe. Sarah smiled to herself, the weight on her shoulders lifting just a little. For a moment, she felt like herself again. But when she walked inside, she was met by Robert's gaze. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told her everything. He had been watching her, waiting for her to come back. The unspoken tension was thick, and Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't keep pretending. Robert had always been able to read her, and now, he knew something was different. She could feel it in the air. As she walked past him, she couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt. Was it fair to be texting John like this? Was she betraying Robert, even if it was just emotionally? She didn't know. All she knew was that she was done hiding. That night, as they sat together in silence, Sarah realized something. She could keep pretending, keep living in a world where everything was about Robert, or she could finally take control of her own life. It was a terrifying thought, but it was the only one that made sense. She couldn't stay in this marriage, not if it meant losing herself completely. And so, with a deep breath, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would talk to Robert. She would finally tell him the truth. She was no longer going to be a passive participant in her own life. She was going to take the reins, no matter how difficult it would be. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was ready to face it. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of determination. She had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. The house was eerily quiet, just like every other morning, but today felt different. Today, she would speak the truth. Today, she would finally confront Robert about everything that had been building up between them for so long. She had no idea how he would react, but she knew she couldn't go another day pretending. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, she felt the weight of her decision. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup down, her heart racing. She glanced at the clock, realizing that Robert would be up soon. There was no more avoiding this conversation. Robert had always been someone who was difficult to read. His moods were unpredictable, and his silence often made it impossible for Sarah to gauge how he was feeling. But today, she had to face it. She had to find the courage to tell him the truth. As Robert entered the kitchen, he greeted her with his usual indifference, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. Sarah could tell he had sensed something was different. He could always tell when something was off. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft but distant. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "Robert," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "We need to talk." Robert raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in her tone. He didn't say anything, just waited for her to continue. "I can't keep pretending," Sarah said, her words coming out in a rush. "I can't keep living like this. I feel like I'm losing myself, and I don't know who I am anymore. This marriage, it's not working." Robert's face remained unreadable, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, the tightening of his fists at his sides. He was waiting for her to say more, but she wasn't sure how to continue. How could she explain years of built-up frustration, of feeling trapped, of wanting to be seen and loved for who she truly was, not for who Robert wanted her to be? "I feel like I'm invisible to you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "You've controlled everything, from the way I act to who I talk to. And I let it happen because I thought that's what love was. But I was wrong. I've lost myself in this relationship, and I can't do it anymore." Robert's expression faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he said nothing. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she took a deep breath and continued. "I've been talking to someone else. John. And I know it probably sounds terrible, but I've realized that I've been so starved for real connection, for real conversations, for someone who sees me as a person, not just an extension of you. I don't know what it means yet, but I need to be honest with you about everything." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Robert didn't speak right away, and Sarah had no idea what was going through his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Robert spoke, his voice low and cold. "So, this is what it's come to. You've been talking to another man behind my back." Sarah could feel her heart drop into her stomach. The words stung, but they weren't a surprise. "It's not like that," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "I didn't do this to hurt you. I just needed something real." Robert didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes locked onto hers, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Sarah felt like she might suffocate from it. Finally, Robert spoke again, his tone softer now, though there was still an edge to it. "I don't know how we got here," he said quietly. "But I can't pretend that everything is okay anymore, either." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she didn't know what it meant yet. She had taken the first step, the hardest part of the conversation. And now, for the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe. She wasn't sure what would happen next, or if Robert would even understand. But one thing was clear, she couldn't keep living in this cycle. She had to find herself again, even if it meant facing the unknown. Sarah looked at Robert, unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to reclaim her life. The conversation with Robert had left Sarah feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had said what needed to be said, but the silence between them now was thick with tension. Robert had heard her, but whether he truly understood was still unclear. He hadn't yelled or tried to fight back, which was both a blessing and a curse. The calmness in his demeanor only made Sarah more nervous, as if he was holding his emotions back, waiting for the right moment to explode. For the next few days, things were awkward but civil. Robert didn't mention the conversation again, and Sarah didn't bring it up. It was as if they were both in a state of suspended animation, unsure of what to do next. Sarah found herself in a strange limbo, trying to piece together the life she had known and the new life she wanted to build. The house, once a home full of laughter and plans, now felt empty and cold. She would catch herself staring at the walls, wondering how things had gone so wrong. She missed the woman she used to be, the confident, free-spirited person who didn't second-guess every decision. But somewhere along the way, she had lost that version of herself, buried under layers of expectations and compromises. She thought about John often, not in a romantic sense, but in the way he had made her feel seen, heard, valued. He had given her a glimpse of who she could be, and now she couldn't ignore that feeling. She wasn't ready to make any decisions about him, but she knew she needed more of that connection in her life. One evening, after dinner, Sarah sat in the living room, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Robert was in the kitchen, cleaning up. As he always did, his movements automatic. Sarah knew he was avoiding her, avoiding the conversation that still lingered in the air. He didn't know how to handle this change, and Sarah didn't know how to help him understand. She had tried for so long to be the perfect wife, the woman he wanted her to be, but now she realized that she couldn't keep doing it. She couldn't keep pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from John. "How are you doing today? Hope you're feeling better." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was enough to make her feel like she mattered. She typed a quick response, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. The message felt like a small lifeline in a sea of confusion. As she waited for his reply, she found herself reflecting on the choices she had made, the road she had walked to get to this point. She had spent years walking in Robert's shadow, afraid to step out of line, afraid to rock the boat. But now, she wasn't sure she could stay on this path any longer. She wanted to break free, to breathe again, to find herself outside of this marriage. The uncertainty of it all was overwhelming. She couldn't deny that a part of her still loved Robert, but the person she had become with him wasn't the person she wanted to be. It was a constant battle between what she felt she should do and what she knew she had to do for her own well-being. Just as she was about to set her phone down, it buzzed again. John had replied, "I know things have been tough for you. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The simplicity of his words comforted her. It wasn't about romance or promises, it was about kindness, about human connection. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had been so focused on keeping her marriage together, on trying to make it work, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly heard, to be seen for who she was. She had neglected herself in the process. As she put the phone down, she realized that no matter what happened next, she couldn't keep living in fear. She had to take control of her own life, no matter how scary it was. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was on the verge of something important. She didn't know if she would stay or leave, but she knew that the decision had to be hers. She couldn't continue living for someone else. She had to live for herself, and that thought brought a sense of clarity that had been missing for so long. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy calm. Sarah continued to feel the weight of her decision pressing on her chest, but she also felt a small flicker of hope that she hadn't felt in years. Every morning, she woke up with the same sense of uncertainty, but also a quiet resolve. She wasn't sure what the future would look like, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she was ready to face it. Her relationship with Robert remained distant, though they spoke when necessary. The conversations were short, almost transactional. They had moved beyond the point of pretending that everything was fine. The tension that had once filled their home was now replaced by an uncomfortable silence, a silence that neither of them seemed willing to break. Sarah knew Robert was struggling with her decision, but he hadn't voiced it. He had retreated into himself, perhaps trying to process everything, or perhaps waiting for her to change her mind. Sarah, on the other hand, had made up hers. She couldn't go back to the woman she had been. She couldn't keep living in a marriage that stifled her, that kept her from being who she truly was. One evening, after a long day at work, Sarah sat alone in the living room, staring out the window. The house felt strangely empty, despite the fact that Robert was just a few rooms away. She had gotten used to the silence between them, but it never failed to make her feel like she was living in a ghostly version of her own life. As she sat there, her phone buzzed. It was another message from John, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate to open it. "How are you doing?" "Just checking in," the text read. A small smile tugged at the corners of Sarah's lips. She had been hesitant to get too close to John, but the more they talked, the more she realized that he made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, appreciated. He saw her, not just as a wife or a mother, but as a person. As she typed her response, she felt a sense of warmth wash over her, something she hadn't felt with Robert in ages. She knew she wasn't ready to make any decisions about John, but the connection she had with him felt like a lifeline. It was a reminder that she could still be more than just a wife, more than just someone else's idea of who she should be. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke her from her thoughts. Robert had walked into the living room, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sarah for a moment, then glanced at the phone in her hand. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice distant. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge the tension that had been building between them. She quickly put the phone down on the coffee table, her mind racing. "Just a friend," she replied, trying to sound casual. "Someone from work." Robert didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face, as if trying to decipher something that wasn't there. Finally, he nodded and turned away, heading toward the kitchen. Sarah could feel the weight of his unspoken words. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. She knew Robert was hurt, but she also knew that this was a reality they both had to face. The marriage they had built was no longer sustainable, no longer healthy. It was only a matter of time before they both had to face the truth. Sarah spent the next few days wrestling with the decision that had been haunting her. She loved Robert, or at least she used to. But the love she felt for him had changed. It had become twisted by control, by jealousy, and by a fear of losing herself. She couldn't live in that environment anymore. But even as she made the decision to move on, a part of her felt guilty. She didn't want to hurt Robert. She didn't want to destroy what they had, but she couldn't stay in a marriage that wasn't allowing her to be who she was. The internal conflict was overwhelming. She felt like she was being pulled in two different directions, but she knew that staying would only lead to more pain for both of them. The hardest part was realizing that the life she had worked so hard to build wasn't the life she wanted anymore. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror one evening, her reflection a reminder of the woman she had become. She didn't recognize her own face, but she knew that the person looking back at her had the power to make a change. It was time to take control of her own story. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to find out. The days following Sarah's decision were filled with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She had made the choice to confront the truth, to take control of her own life, but the uncertainty of what would come next still weighed heavily on her. Robert had remained distant since that evening when she had opened up to him. His silence was deafening, and every conversation between them felt like a delicate dance, with both of them stepping around the things that mattered most. The house had become a space where the air was thick with unspoken words. Neither of them knew how to move forward, but they both knew something had to change. Sarah felt trapped between two worlds, the life she had with Robert and the life she was beginning to build for herself. She no longer felt like the woman who had once walked alongside him, the woman who had swallowed her doubts and put his needs before her own. She had spent so many years trying to fit into the mold of the perfect wife, but now she was starting to realize that the woman she had become wasn't the woman she wanted to be. She longed for something more, something real, something that wasn't defined by control or fear. Sarah knew she had to be brave. One afternoon, after a long day at work, she sat down in the quiet of the living room, her thoughts swirling. She knew she couldn't keep living in this emotional limbo. The silence between her and Robert was eating away at her, and she realized she had waited long enough. She had to speak up, to set the boundary that had been missing for so long. She was no longer afraid to ask for what she needed. She needed her own space, her own identity. She needed to feel like she was living for herself, not for anyone else's expectations. As the evening wore on, Robert came into the room, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of what she was thinking. Sarah had grown used to his silent observations, but today, something was different. Today, she was ready to make her feelings known. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice steady. Robert's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in a while, there was a flicker of concern in his expression. He nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. "I can't keep living like this," Sarah said, her words firm and clear. "I've been trying to make everything work, but I've been losing myself in the process. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not. I need space, I need time to figure out who I really am outside of this marriage." Robert didn't interrupt, but Sarah could see the hurt in his eyes. She had known this conversation wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. "I don't want to hurt you," she continued, "but I can't keep living in fear, in silence, in this shell of a life we've been leading. I need to be me again, to remember who I am without all the expectations. I need to find my own voice, my own happiness." There was a long silence between them as Robert absorbed her words. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the years of tension and unspoken frustration finally coming to a head. She had expected him to fight, to argue, but instead, he looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know how we got here, Sarah," he said. "I don't know how things became so broken. But I can't deny that something has changed. I can't force you to stay if you don't want to." His words, though soft, hit Sarah hard. It was the acknowledgement she had been waiting for, the recognition that their marriage, as it was, couldn't continue. There was no going back to the way things were. "I never wanted to control you," Robert continued. "I thought I was doing what was best. But I see now that I've been holding you back, holding us both back. I never wanted to lose you." Sarah could hear the sincerity in his voice, but it wasn't enough to change the course she had set for herself. She had to let go, for her own well-being. "I know," Sarah said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "But I can't keep living this way. I need to take care of myself now." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a mix of sadness and relief. She had finally said the truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the burden she had carried for so long. Robert didn't say anything else. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that things between them had shifted, maybe beyond repair. Sarah stood up slowly, feeling the exhaustion of the past few weeks wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to take the next step in her life, whatever that might be. I'm sure you've heard your fair share of millionaire stories, but none quite like this one. In this emotional journey, Sarah finds herself at a crossroads in a marriage that once promised everything. Living under the control of a man who demanded perfection, she begins to lose herself in the process, leading her to the difficult realization that she can't continue living this way. This millionaire story goes beyond wealth and materialism, exploring deeper themes of self-worth, personal freedom, and the courage to make life-changing decisions. As Sarah grapples with her emotions, she reaches out for a connection that brings her back to who she truly is, reminding us that even in millionaire stories, the most valuable thing is discovering who we are, beyond the facades. This millionaire story is a tale of struggle, courage, and the search for truth, showing that no matter how much money or status one may have, it is the emotional and personal growth that truly defines a successful life. If you're looking for an inspiring story about personal growth, overcoming obstacles, and the challenges of living in a controlling relationship, this is the kind of millionaire story that speaks to the heart. In the end, Sarah's story is one of empowerment, reminding us that even in the most difficult circumstances, we have the power to reclaim our lives and write our own futures. So, dive into this millionaire story and witness the transformation that comes from finding the strength to break free from the expectations of others and embrace the life we truly deserve.